The room smelled of lemon polish and the metallic tang of rain as Marco wiped his palms on the hem of his jacket and watched Isabella Moretti, Donna of 100 silent wars, stand as still as a statue, the girl at the center of her gaze like an accusation and a prayer. Elena's eyes shifted between them, small ripples of distrust and hunger passing across a face that had learned how to hold back storms. Isabella's body, trained for command, vibrated with an impatience she did not allow herself to name. For a heartbeat, the city outside the office dissolved into a single point, the locket at the girl's throat, a cracked bullet of silver on a chain like a memory kept too long in the dark. "You come into my house," Isabella said finally, voice low and even, and every syllable was a measure of control. "You bring me ghosts. You expect me to open my doors because some janitor has had pity?" There was an old quickness in her words now, sharp, cold, the blade that had cut friends and enemies into neat, useful pieces. Marco's palms were wet. The locket trembled against Elena's sternum as if it had its own need to be nearer to that voice. Marco swallowed and met Isabella's gaze with something that had cost him more than the many nights spent polishing tile floors. "She didn't come alone," he said. "She could barely walk. She used my mop for a cane, Donna. I could not—" He stopped. The appellation left a residue of fear. He had called her Donna so many times in the shadows of her buildings, in the places where he'd feared recognition more than he feared a lockpicking. It felt like kneeling under a leader he had watched from afar. I couldn't leave her at the door. A laugh escaped Isabella that seemed to surprise even her. "You are all bravado, Marco Rivera. You sweep floors and think you can sweep away arrangements?" "I don't think I can sweep away anything except dirt," Marco said, softer. His eyes flicked to Elena, who had flinched. "But she's not garbage. She is—" He had rehearsed words, phrases that could be useful. Vulnerable, found, mistaken, but none of them reached what he felt, which was simple and dangerous. She might be the daughter of the only woman who had ever mattered to him when it mattered, and the only woman he feared when it mattered. "She has this," he said, and he reached up to touch the locket before Elena could pull it under her collar. Isabella's hand moved faster than thought, an instinct honed by a life spent breaking patterns. She cupped the locket in her fingers, the metal cool, the engraving warned where a tiny fingertip had traced it before. Elena watched the exchange like someone watching a ritual from which she had once been excluded. Her fingers had been inked with map-like scars. Her voice, when she spoke, was thin and cautious. "My name is Elena," she said. "Elena Moretti. She stopped. The title seemed to sit in the air between them like a gamble. The room seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see which way the coin would fall. Isabella, who had kept the city at a measured distance, let the locket rest in her palm and closed her fingers around it. What she held smelled faintly of old perfume and detergent. It smelled of a small life suspended in a large, dangerous one. "I have men who can verify bloodlines," Isabella said, the authority in her voice returning like tidewater reclaiming sand. "I have archives." "You are not to leave this building, Elena. You are to sleep in a room that I will select. Marco, you can go. You did what you thought right. Leave now and forget this night." Marco hesitated. The old lines had been drawn. The Donna's command, the janitor's acquiescence. But when Elena's eyes lifted and fastened on his face, there was a rawness there, an unspent capacity for hope that went straight through whatever fear kept Marco small. "She doesn't have anywhere else," he heard himself say. "She has nothing else." That was not obedience. That was an arming of his voice. Isabella's gaze flicked to him, and for the first time since he had scrubbed her marble, Marco felt seen by her in a way that had nothing to do with guilt or utility. It was dangerous to be seen by anyone who could alter your life with a raise or a ruin. You stay in the lobby until I tell you where to go. You let my people handle the rest. You will not speak to the press. You will not post this. You will return to your shifts and you will do your job. If you fail me, I will make sure your wife's grave is lined in stones you cannot afford." The threat landed, thudded like a closed fist in his chest. Marco's jaw clenched. He had a widow's pittance and a small box of everyday relics stacked in his head like a careful shrine. The threat was not new, but it never stopped feeling like a jag of ice. "Yes, Donna," he said, but the word tasted like iron, because he also had a responsibility that outranked fear, Elena's hollowed-out stare that begged for shelter. He moved to leave, but Elena's small hand caught his sleeve. She was thinner than he'd expected. Her fingers were rough, as if they'd learned to survive with objects rather than people. For days after that night, the tower operated on a brittle efficiency. People untangled information for Isabella. Handwriting analysts and private lab results, digital archaeologists who specialized in stolen identities. Elena hovered in a borrowed room, a caged animal that had not yet learned the rules of a new territory. Isabella watched her with an intensity that suggested a weapon was being studied, not a child. She flinched at every false step and watched every small habit as if pattern recognition could be a lifeline. Marco returned to the lobby and resumed his rounds. He pushed mobs as if nothing had happened and listened to the city like an old radio searching for a station. But the work was a thin membrane over something wide and raw. He found himself thinking of the room Elena slept in, wondering whether she slept at all. He added small things to his night shifts, extra coffee by the pantry, a folded towel with a kinder thread of fabric. He told no one. His hands, so used to cleaning other people's messes, took to making impressions of care where he could. Elena was not oiled into the role of grief easily. She asked questions that were small, precise, and dangerous. Did Isabella ever cry? Why did the city smell like lemon in the morning? Who fed the pigeons? She had a way of observing the world that suggested she was cataloging details for future use. Marco answered what he could. He could not and would not lie about the dangers of proximity to the Moretti name. "People get paid to disappear from our view," he told her once, because shame and fear had taught him that the language of soft truth often arrived as blunt force. They fly away, or they are ground down under the weight of what they know. Elena listened. She was a reader of faces, a student of the small mercies that meant you might be trusted. She began to tilt her head towards the light that filtered down the atrium at noon. She learned where the spare towels were kept, found the syrup dispenser that a few corporate executives like to hide behind their teeth, and discovered that Marco never ate the pastries he bought for himself at the corner bakery. He gave them away to the men polishing the brass rail on the second floor. She watched him perform kindness as if it were a ritual of survival. For her part, Isabella moved through the city like a queen testing a chessboard. Her first orders were practical and procedural. Fingerprints, DNA samples, a scan of the locket for embedded micro-inscriptions, a search for missing person reports that fit Elena's sparse composite stories. There were no matches that lit up the way Lena Moretti's disappearance had once lit up every channel. Instead, there were fragments. Names harvested from trafficking databases, blurred photos pulled from a dozen nights known to be violent, and a single, maddening discrepancy. The locket's engraving was exactly like the one she had lost, but the metal's alloy and age suggested something that could have been cast last year. Isabella's men moved like shadows with invoices. They sent feelers into the networks Isabella controlled and the ones she did not. They questioned small-time fence merchants, interviewed a woman who sold second-hand children's shoes from a shop near the river, and tugged at threads that led to an undercurrent of cash moving between certain corporate coffers and overseas sites specializing in identity laundering. Someone had been buying more than identities. They'd been buying the shape of grief. The city takes its own time in revenge and redemption. It arranges them like tectonic plates, and when those plates finally move, the consequences are seismic. Isabella felt those shifts in a bruise in her sternum. She discovered a pattern of staged disappearances designed to be sold to the highest bidder. It was a low-tech horror made sophisticated by capital. A ring that hyped images and stories on social feeds to create sympathetic narratives, and then sold those narratives to families desperate for closure. Once the families were in the thrall of the story, the ring offered resolution services for a fee. It was both human and corporate avarice wrapped around the fragile thing that was a parent's need to know. And in a quiet lab in a building Isabella owned but kept far from public view, the first forensic detail came back. The DNA under the locket, one tiny flake of skin, a thread of hair, did not match Isabella's. It did not match her bloodline. The paper sat on Isabella's desk like evidence in a case that had no finish line. She turned it over with a finger that had pushed men out of rooms and nations into new realignments, and she felt an unfamiliar wobble of something like betrayal, not at another person, but at the machinery of the world. She had always believed you could buy truth if you paid enough. The lab reports suggested she had been wrong. Elena, who had been given supervised walks in the garden for air and time, began to ask for things that sounded like memory. "Is that the fountain where my father used to throw coins?" she asked one afternoon. And the question pierced a place Isabella had fortified until it was cold as marble. Isabella watched the way Elena traced the fountain's lip, the way her hand slid along the stone as if remembering the contours. There was a plausibility in those tiny gestures that made men who had fought under her banner look over their shoulders and breathe faster. "You have to stay away from the press," Isabella told Elena one morning, leaning over a table where the girl hesitated between a plate of fruit and a glass of juice. "You must speak only when I allow. You understand?" Elena's answer was patient, like a child who'd been trained in silence. "I'm learning," she said. There was a thrum of authority in her voice that did not match her smallness. Marco, who overheard the exchange from the doorway, felt his chest constrict at the depth of what was not said, what had been taken. Suspicion, however, is a contagious thing. In the days that followed, business associates with teeth as sharp as vultures began to circle. A rival CEO, Enzo Cardo, called Isabella in a tone so smooth it felt like oil across knives. He suggested, with a smile that had been paid for in small betrayals, that perhaps Isabella's grief had clouded her judgment. "A woman of your standing," he said, "must be careful with nostalgia. Nostalgia can be weaponized." It was a sentence designed to be a threat and a courtesy in the same breath. Isabella, who had made enemies out of men who tried to look kind, felt the old reflex rise. She replied in a way that did not give away the tremors beneath her calm. "Do not presume you can speak to me about my family." Enzo laughed then, sharp and brittle. "Family is a product for sale these days, Bella. You know that. What would it take for you to consider a partnership? We have distribution channels, we could—" Isabella ended the call before he finished. The man was a vulture with a corporate license. He wanted to hollow out her territories and fill them with sanitized profit. He wanted to make grief into a commodity that fed his bottom line. The thought made Isabella's jaw ache. Marco, meanwhile, had not been idle. At night, when the tower exhaled and its luxury slumbered, he sat in the service pantry and ran fingers over scrapped notebooks that smelled of coffee and old code. He had once been a low-tier hacker. The work had been a means of survival and an act of cowardice that had saved him from the worst of the city's appetites. He had scrubbed traces for clients who wanted to live different lives. He had also seen how easy it was to twist a story until it matched a desired narrative. Those nights in the pantry, he opened the notebooks and found his old self like a stranger. He had learned to read the language of false leads, of manufactured alibis and bought witnesses. The idea that Elena could be a pawn in a corporate game climbed up his throat like bile. He had a talent for tracing lines in the dark, for turning a smear of code into a map that led somewhere real. He could, perhaps, do what the Moretti labs could not, find the hand printing the puppet strings. But doing so would risk the one commodity he had left, anonymity. The city kept a ledger of sins, and it loved to reconcile debts. Marco thought of the widow's photograph in his wallet, of the rosary he rubbed on bad nights, and of the small, steady life he had built like a house of cards. To pull up a corner of the city's rug and expose the rot beneath would be to invite knives. It would also be to risk Isabella's wrath. Still, he began. He pulled a password from a memory like a loose thread and found a back door that smelled of cheap pizza and colder alliances. He traced a transfer, a small string of currency that had gone from a charity's shell to an offshore account. He followed it to a server nestled in a leased space that had more VPNs than employees. The leads were thin, but they were there. He found a profile that had posted staged images of lost children with fabricated timelines. And beneath those posts were the fingerprints of ad buys that funneled money through a network of innocuous holding companies. It was the sleight of hand of a world that traded in moral obfuscation. When Marco presented the first of his findings to Isabella, folded into a neat report because he had learned that the Donna liked things that could be understood at a glance, she took the paper and read it without flinching. Her eyes moved quickly, like the hands of a clock. She did not show gratitude immediately. She showed something else, calculating interest. Marco's chest began to loosen as if a belt had been unbuckled. He had been bracing for an anger that had failed to arrive. Instead, Isabella's mind was a machine. She asked questions that probed. She found imperfections in his methodology, and she pointed them out with a dryness that was not cruel but exacting. "You did this on your own," she said. There was a trace of surprise in her voice. She had expected men to bring her polished, expensive things, not evidence warmed by someone's hunger to do right. You could get yourself killed. "Maybe I don't mind that much," Marco said, and the sentence surprised him with its truth. Behind it was a man who had been busy saving excuses for cowardice until excuses had become a habit. "Maybe I'm tired of being small." Isabella watched him as if considering whether to keep him in a box marked usefully naive or to pull him into the inner workings of a machine that chewed up small men and spat out lessons. She chose neither at first. She chose pragmatism. "Continue," she said. "Find the path from those accounts to a person. Find the interfaces. Bring me names." It became a shared obsession, fragile as spun sugar and as combustible. Marco pushed at the seams of the net, finding small nodes, finding a middleman who used the face of a charity to launder not only money but identities. He found a woman who agreed to sell contact lists for an absurd price, and men who would fabricate a child with the right accent for a campaign designed to catch a grieving eye. The deeper he went, the more the picture curdled into a plan so cynical it seemed almost politically modern. Use the world's appetite for resolution to create a pipeline of leverage. Elena watched the two of them, Isabella, who could reduce an international threat to a checkbox, and Marco, who could trace a footprint on a server, like someone learning how to make a fire. She began, slowly, to ask for small favors. She asked to be allowed to see the city's old theater, which Isabella owned but rarely visited. She begged to sit on the roof where Isabella sometimes watched storms and think. Isabella allowed it sometimes, then not at all, then with conditions. The arrangement was a dance of proximity. Each step forward was measured against 100 possible betrayals. But proximity produces human failures. The nights crowded with encoded transactions and 100 little interviews also produced flickers of what might be tenderness. Marco and Elena shared a cup of coffee in the pantry one dawn, sipping through cardboard lids. The light was thin and practical, not romantic, but it warmed Elena's hands and calmed the tremor in the little lines around her mouth. Marco taught her how to fold a napkin without making it messy. She taught him how to listen to silence and call it something other than absence. Isabella noticed everything. She watched the two of them and felt a strange contraction, a fear of what might occur if Elena began to prefer a janitor's kindness to a boss's guarded embrace. She also felt another emotion, jealousy, sharpened into clarity, because she had spent years forbidding herself the very small things Elena now accepts like currency, a shared joke, the warmth of a palm given without expected return. The city, however, resents comfort. The rival CEO Enzo Cardo did not sleep when others slept. He moved through the corridors of power like someone who had been anointed by other people's mistakes. He did not wait for time to finish sharpening the knife. He went to work forging it. He began to leak certain carefully curated rumors designed to make Isabella look soft. A woman found with a child had always been Isabella's weakness, Enzo's people said quietly to journalists who liked tastefully scandalous headlines. They printed a photograph of Elena feeding pigeons, an image of domesticity framed as disaster. The feeds lit like fuse lines. Isabella responded with a surgical calm. She released a statement that Elena was under her protection and that any insinuation of deception would be met with legal violence and financial ruin. She used threats and lawyers and a shadow that had been honed into a whip. Yet beneath the policy was a tremor. She had to protect the girl and the truth, and she had to balance both without revealing the brittle machinery of her own heart. The tension tightened. Enzo mounted boardroom pressure, pushing shareholders to question Isabella's acquisitions and her leadership. He used the rumor of Elena as leverage to demand cedings, concessions, to step between Isabella and territories she'd claimed with blood and brilliance. He offered an alliance called stability in exchange for a fraction of control. It had the smell of a poisoned olive branch. Isabella did not answer with immediate violence. Instead, she moved like an animal that had been wounded not in the flesh, but in the belief that everything would be perfectly calculable. She convened a meeting in a room that had been built to break people elegantly. Her executives sat in silence and drank her intention as if it were medicine. She told them quietly that the city was a living ledger, and sometimes what looked like weakness could be a strategic redeployment. She planned counters that read like poetry, a combination of market manipulations, legal pressure, and targeted intelligence that could make Enzo's holdings look like a house built on sand. Meanwhile, Marco dug deeper. He found a ledger that linked a shell company to the ad buys. He found that someone had scheduled the release of Elena's photos to coincide with a shareholder vote penciled into Enzo's calendar. It was an attempt to fracture Isabella's holdings by making her look impulsive, unstable, liable. It was a cunning, modern war. Use image and rumor to manipulate markets and then collect the assets of a weakened queen. When Marco brought his findings to Isabella in a slender packet, she read them and folded the paper with a hand that did not tremble. She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment there was something like gratitude on her face. "You done this without calling me," she said, and the sentence fell like a small private triumph. "No," Marco admitted. "I didn't know what would happen. I couldn't sit and watch." "You did the right thing then," Isabella said, and for the first time, that sentence was not hollow with command. It was an offering. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, hands behind her back. The city at night looked like a map of circuits and arteries. "We'll move carefully. We'll trade a piece, perhaps, to take a bigger piece later. We will not let Enzo get inside us." The plan that unfolded was surgical. Isabella and Marco coordinated with analysts and lawyers who owed her favors double and triple. They produced counter-narratives that undermined Enzo's claims. They audited Enzo's holdings and found small irregularities that made investors nervous. And they planted a quiet story about a rival CEO's history of exploiting market vulnerabilities for private profit. It was legal war and social media guerrilla tactics braided into one. Enzo countered with, first, denials, then a smear campaign that hinted at deeper truths, suggestions that the girl might be a professional plant, that Isabella, soft with grief, was being played. The cycle accelerated. Elena felt its pressure like a tightening vice around her heart. She withdrew into silences she did not let Marco breach sometimes, because some fears could not be soothed with coffee and small gestures. One night, Marco found her on the roof, under a sky that had lost the city's brightness to a thunderstorm. She looked smaller against the concrete parapet, the rain soaking the shoulders of her jacket. He sat next to her without asking. For a time, they watched the city flash and rumble in the distance. "Do you believe me?" Elena asked finally, voice barely there. The vulnerability in the question was a raw bargain. She was asking not for a fact, but for acceptance. Marco did not answer right away. He thought of the notebooks in the pantry, of the little trails of code that had led him here. He thought of his wife's photograph, of his vow to be honest in ways that had been foreign to him. "I want to," he said, "and I'm working on it." Elena's laugh was a small, surprised thing. "That's as much as anyone has offered me," she said. "People offer proof, people offer witnesses, people buy images. They don't offer wanting." They sat in a silence that was heavy and not empty. The storm came down harder, and the smell of wet asphalt and lemon polish braided itself into the air between them. For a few moments, Marco allowed himself a thought that had scared him since he first saw Elena in the doorway of Isabella's office, that he could become someone who would risk everything for someone like her, for the fragile knot of being wanted and belonging. But the city insisted on cost. Enzo escalated his assault by leaking an old surveillance clip taken near a riverbank years ago. The image was grainy, the camera's angle poor, the night, yet the silhouette in the footage had a posture reminiscent of a child Isabella once loved. The clip did not prove Elena's identity, but it fed the narrative that Isabella's heart could be exploited. Shareholders panicked. Wall Street murmured. The stock value of one of Isabella's holdings dipped in a single cruel morning. Isabella responded with something far more dangerous than rage, a dismantling. She offered to sell a subsidiary that was a prized jewel to pacify the markets. The gesture was an admission, a slice of territory given up to preserve a larger whole. It was also a test. She built a plan to keep Enzo's head down, bring him into a controlled collapse where his own holdings would shame him into silence. The chess game moved fast and sharp. And Marco, who had been digging through server logs like a man seeking a buried map, found a new piece of the puzzle. The riverbank clip had been uploaded from a smartphone app connected to a phone number traced to a shell Gmail registered to a small-time fixer who had been paid by someone with a corporate email address, one that resolved to an executive assistant working directly for Enzo Cardo. The path was not clean, but it was a path. Marco realized in a moment of icy clarity that if a thin string connected the rumor to Enzo, they could pull the string and potentially unravel a whole campaign. He took the discovery to Isabella. He knelt as if to make it ceremonial and slid the evidence across her desk. She ran a fingertip through the logs and let out a breath like a blade being sharpened. For a second, somewhere under the cool center, the woman who had been insulated from pity stood revealed only as human. Her fingers tightened around the paper until the edges bent. "We do this right," she said. "We expose him, and we make sure every investor who profited from his campaign knows what he is. We hurt him where he counts." Marco looked up and felt something unnameable shift in him. He had been so willing to be small. The city had taught him to be invisible because visibility meant pain. Yet here, at the edge of the Moretti Empire, he had discovered that there were battles worth the pain. Isabella, too, had her own reckoning. She could finally wield power that did not only crush, but could also protect. The act closed with movement in print. Legal teams put pressure on his holdings. Digital forensic teams, some openly working for Isabella and some quietly grateful to the janitor who had seen what he could see, began to pull threads that would later make Enzo's board of directors uncomfortable. Elena watched as the machinery of consequence rose to meet a rumor. She watched Isabella move through it like a storm, but strangely with tender intent toward the small, breakable thing at the center of the confusion. Underneath all of it, Marco continued to stitch the night together with threadbare courage. He watched Isabella watch Elena with the attention of a woman choosing which relic to save. He felt a closeness growing that frightened him because it was not just for Elena, it was for the space between the two of them, an intimacy born of shared danger and a mutual willingness to be real when the city offered only pretense. And as the chessboard shifted, as Enzo found himself checked from a direction he had not imagined, and Elena learned to not trust kindness too quickly, the pressure built to a dangerous degree. The city had two options for them. One, that it would grind them between its gears, or two, that it would teach them how to be something other than the roles they had been assigned. On the horizon, lightning flared again, and somewhere in the towers of the Moretti Empire, decisions were being made that would not only determine a boardroom's fate, but whether a lost daughter would become a found person in more than paperwork. The stakes gathered like a storm cloud. The pause before the next move felt like the inhalation before a leap. The clip that tore through the quiet like a thrown stone was not grainy by accident. Someone had taken care to fuzz the edges, to give it the wrong timestamp, to tuck a little digital lie into the metadata so that anyone who tried to pull the thread would find their hands in mud. It showed a small figure at the riverbank, a tilted head, a scarf that might once have been familiar to Isabella's eyes. The caption, purposeful and merciless, asked a question more than it asserted. So what if this is hers? What will you do, Donna, when your past is trending? When the footage spread, the tower hummed with a different frequency. Boardroom calls became a chorus of asks, explanations, assurances, contingency plans. Isabella's phone became a ring she could not ignore. Enzo smiled in interviews and let others do his cruelty for him. He had found a way to get the market to do his dirty work. Fear became liquidity. But fear could be traced, and tracing it was what Marco had chosen in the dark. Isabella read the clip once and then again, not for evidence, but for the feeling it conjured, an old tenderness, a public wound. She kept her face still, then called for a forensic team to examine the file layer by layer. She had men with code who could unspool a lie as if it were cotton. They found patterns, a series of edits, metadata stripped in a way a novice would overlook, ad buys arranged to amplify the footage in markets where investors might be stirred into panic. The attack was a manufactured chorus designed to make morality look like instability. But even as Isabella gathered facts, a different fissure opened in the quieter places. Marco's modest report had been a spark. The janitor's late-night digs into servers uncovered more than Enzo's fingerprints. They revealed people inside Isabella's orbit who had quietly traded favors for future safeties. Legal counsel who had taken ambiguous payments, a family friend who had been pressured into signing an affidavit that no one remembered drafting, a lieutenant whose loyalty had once been unassailable. Loyalty in Isabella's world had always been a ledger, and now a few entries balanced on a razor. Isabella's reaction was swift and surgical. She convened her inner circle and watched them as one might watch a house of cards. She did not accuse in the way strangers do. She stripped privilege with the cold competence of someone who had learned to remove parts of herself that no longer served survival. A lawyer was shown the door with a quiet payment and a warning to leave town. A lieutenant found his responsibilities reduced to errands. The message was clear. Betrayal, whether corporate or intimate, would be prevented before it could be weaponized. But punishment did not mend what had been broken. Marco felt the first real wedge between him and Isabella the afternoon she dismissed a man he'd thought an ally, Matteo, an old co-worker who had once helped Marco with a line of code that covered a missing month in his ledger. Marco's protest had been small, the threadbare urgency of someone trying not to make waves. "He helped me once," Marco had said, because gratitude was a language ingrained in him. Isabella's answer was a look. "Gratitude is not enough in my world." The sentence landed like a verdict. Marco felt the heat in his face as if he'd been struck. For the first time since he'd pushed mops in her halls, he realized that Isabella's protection did not extend to the people who looked to him for mercy. Her mercy belonged to causes that served her strategy. That realization hammered at the fragile scaffolding of his loyalty. Elena watched the fracture with animal precision. She saw Marco go to the pantry and stay there longer than usual, fingers worrying at the edge of a napkin, jaw tight. She saw Isabella close ranks when a question about the locket's provenance became too loud. In the quiet between moves, Elena began to reach for the one truth that might hold them: her own memories. They were fogged and unreliable, created in pieces, to keep a child alive, but they were hers. She began to write, at first in the margins of the library's discarded magazines, then in a small notebook she kept secret in the hollow of her shoe. The words were jagged, locations, scents, people's faces, but they were a map of the self that no one could buy. That notebook became dangerous currency. One night, while Elena slept fitfully, the book fell out of her shoe and slid under a table near the library's window. A low-ranking intern found it, an eager face who wanted favor more than loyalty, and the intern brought it to a man who liked to be first with a scoop. The man did not understand why the lines were important. He saw only a potential headline. He sent a photo of the pages to a contact, and the image moved like a virus. When Isabella saw the image on a reporter's phone, she did not show surprise. She showed calculation. She closed the reporter out of the room and issued a statement that called the notebook a forgery, a cunningly staged artifact designed to manipulate sentiment. The statement was ruthless and effective. The story faded from hungry feeds, replaced by fact-checked denials. Marco watched the maneuver and felt a hollow in his chest where trust had been. "You cannot protect her from everything," Marco said later, the words a desperate pebble thrown at a fortress he did not know how to breach. "Sometimes protecting her means telling the truth." "You do not understand the many ways truth is used against us," Isabella replied sharply. Her voice was not cruel. It was realpolitik. "If we give them the notebook's truths, we also give them the ability to manufacture pity. We will not weaponize her by telling them more than they need." Her logic was correct as law, and a kind of moral cruelty. Marco understood the calculus, but he felt the moral balance tilt away from what had drawn him to act in the first place: the need to save a person because she was a person. Isabella's decision to bury the notebook, to bury Elena's jagged self, felt like an act of ownership rather than rescue. It made him complicit in a different kind of violence. The tension between action and protection widened into accusation. Marco began to leave tardy notes in the pantry, small things that read like confessions. He would fold a just-washed napkin and tuck a scribble beneath it, a plea that the reader would never see. No one read the notes, but the act was a sacrament for a man who needed to assert his conscience. It was not just Marco who felt betrayed. In the weeks that followed, Isabella discovered a pattern of small deceptions around her. Payouts made through middlemen to men she had trusted. A ledger with missing entries. The realization that even the architecture of her empire had been compromised stung. Her first reaction was not to cut outward, but inward. She began to doubt the judgment that had allowed proximity to erode into complacency. She questioned the very code she had always thought sacrosanct, that blood and loyalty were the anchors of power. The rupture that had been forming widened into something louder when Enzo's camp released a doctored email to a favored tabloid. The email, allegedly from one of Isabella's confidants, suggested that Elena was a staged asset, that Isabella had orchestrated a public drama to manipulate market sentiment. The tabloid spun the story with glee, the feeds amplified it. Investors bristled, a couple of smaller partners issued press releases expressing concern. Isabella watched the market breathe and saw her holdings flutter. In the eye of that storm, betrayals did not need to be direct. They could be useful mistakes. Isabella found herself making calculations that tasted like surrender. She would sell a beloved subsidiary to steady markets. She would remove an executive she'd promoted for reasons that now seemed sentimental. And she would trust a legal team that had once been cautious. Every concession widened the intimacy gap between Isabella and Marco. He could see she was choosing survival. He could not help feeling she was choosing the empire over the girl who might be her daughter. One night, after she had signed papers that would cost the company and perhaps her own sense of invincibility, Isabella asked Marco to stay behind. The tower had emptied, the chandeliers were cold. He stood by the desk while she poured 2 coffees with a hand that did not tremble. "You think I don't feel what I'm giving up?" she asked him, voice low. He swallowed hard. "I think you're doing what you must." She looked at him then, not as Donna, not as judge, but as a woman who had been walking alone for a long time. For a moment, she permitted a softness that was almost dangerous. "Do you understand why I cannot let every truth into the open?" Marco did. He understood the calculus, but he also understood that some silences were cages. "I just know she deserves to be seen without being used," he said. "She deserves someone who will let her tell her story." Isabella's eyes glittered with moisture she did not allow to fall. "And if telling the story destroys everything I have built, then maybe everything built on fear needed to be destroyed," Marco said. The words landed like an accusation and a benediction. Isabella's face hardened, then softened into exhaustion. She had devoted a life to a code that guaranteed survival, and now she was asked for a single human thing to break it. The choice would not be simple. It would cost. Trust was frayed enough that any new stitch might snap. Outside, Enzo's machine revved again. A subpoena here, an anonymous donation ledger leaked there. Isabella moved like a woman with a plan, but the plan required sacrifices that felt like abortions of part of herself. Marco's small rebellions continued. An extra call to a contact, a late-night message to an investigative journalist with a hint not to trust the feeding frenzy. Elena, clutching her hidden notebook, began to understand what it meant to be interior and instrumental at once. The fractures multiplied. Allies who had once smiled now watched for angles. Marco felt at times that his presence in the building was a threat to both Isabella's empire and to Elena's fragile sense of self. He began to keep his distance, to scrub his nights of unnecessary interactions, to sleep less. Isabella, watching him withdraw, wondered if his removal would be a mercy or a loss she could not afford. In the end, the city did what it always does. It refused to let matters rest. Evidence, rumor, transfer ledgers, and torn loyalties all gathered in a pressure that promised an eruption. Each betrayal left a burn as particular as a brand. Some had names, some were only motions, the small evasions that accumulate into ruin. The three of them, Donna, Janitor, and the girl between them, stood on the edge of a decision that would either make them something new or leave them exactly as they had been, powerful, terrified, and entirely alone. The rain had thinned to a hush when Isabella sent everyone out of the war room and left only Marco with the thin file he'd handed her 2 nights before. The city beyond the glass was a blurred smear of lights, the towers like teeth. For a moment, she let herself be human, sat heavy, shoulders unarmored, and watched Marco as if seeing him anew. Not the janitor who kept her floors polished, but the man who had risked everything to trace a lie back to its maker. "I don't ask for loyalty lightly," she said. Her voice held the weight of consequence. "You know what I ask of people. You know the ledger." Marco folded his hands, palms still rough from years of mop handles. "I know you value survival," he said. "I also know you built something that can protect people differently." She considered the truth of that. The plan they were about to set in motion would cost her liquidity, some holdings, and the carefully nurtured myth of invulnerability she'd used to keep children like Elena safe from the market's appetite. It would also, perhaps, cost the one advantage she'd always kept secret, the ability to move without being noticed. "You did the hard part," Isabella admitted. "You found the string to Enzo. You found enough to make him bleed where it matters." She set the file down between them. "We can take him apart quietly, legally, or we can crush him publicly and risk everything. Which do you think will protect her?" Marco looked to the window and then at Elena's photograph, worn, folded, tucked into his wallet. He had promised himself smallness after his wife had gone. Promise, he had learned, was a fragile thing. Now he felt a fierce, honest hunger that matched Isabella's in a different key. Not for power, but for right. "We expose him, but we don't destroy her in the way he would," he said. "We use his own footprints, the calls, the transfers. Someone who'll testify if we give them immunity. We make him answer in the light, not in rumor." Isabella's eyes sharpened. "You would trust a legal system to do what force has always done?" "No," Marco said, "but I trust that truth, put where it cannot be bought, will change how people see her. It will remind them she is not a prop." Isabella breathed out, and for the first time since the locket had touched her palm, she allowed a decision that felt like surrender to be also an act of courage. "Then we do both," she said. "We go public enough to rattle him, quietly enough to control the narrative. We'll offer a controlled disclosure, documents, a whistleblower who will face Enzo in a deposition. We'll hand him papers that show his hands. And we'll give Elena the right to speak when the moment is honest and safe." Marco's relief was an animal thing that made his throat tight. "And me?" "You brought this to me," Isabella said. She studied him like a rare instrument. "You have eyes I would not have paid for. Stay, help us steer it. But know this, staying will put you in danger." He had counted the cost in small, bitter measures. The widow's grave, the rent, the quiet dinners he ate alone. Now a new cost stood lit, the risk of being carved out by a woman he'd come to respect and fear in equal parts. He could walk away, return to his mops and his conscience. Instead, he imagined Elena's small hand in his, and the nauseous way hope made his knees tremble. "I will stay," he said. The strategy moved like a living thing. Isabella called in favors, doling out work to the legal coven she'd paid not to ask too many questions. Marco assembled digital dossiers, his fingers moving over keys with the same steady devotion he'd shown the marble, each line of code a little prayer. Elena was briefed in small increments, given choice, to be visible as a witness or to remain protected. She chose slowly, like a person agreeing to touch a hot stove to remember warmth. "I want to tell the truth," she said, "but not if it becomes a weapon." They set the trap. A whistleblower, an Enzo aide with a conscience bought for too long, was promised asylum and hissed into a deposition room under the weight of subpoenas. Marco watched the feed of transfers and calls, fingers trembling as he matched timestamps to claims. Isabella sat on the dais of legal pressure like a conductor, yielding her power not with bravado but with surgical clarity. A divestment here, a public statement there, an incontrovertible ledger placed before the press. The first blow landed gently and then widened into a tidal wave. The deposition showed Enzo's executive assistant forwarding payment instructions. The forensic trail Marco had built was presented as evidence. Ad buys, metadata, a pattern of behavior that was impossible to spin into kindness. The board that had hung on rumor now had numbers and faces to reckon with. Enzo tried to spin. He tried to fracture alliances. He offered settlements, whispered promises of stability. But the market, amused by spectacle and hungry for certainty, shifted. Investors pulled back. Media outlets that had feasted on salaciousness now found themselves furnished with documents they could not ignore. Enzo's empire bled dry of credibility as more small players named names and accepted immunity. In the quiet of victory, terrible choices remained. Isabella signed sale papers, one she had loved, so that the legal engines could operate without the shadow of improvised markets. She lost holdings that had been named for founders long dead. The sacrifices left her less, but they also bought a space in which Elena could speak without being monetized. The day Elena testified, she wore Marco's old scarf around her neck, a gesture small and enormous. She did not call Isabella mother in court. Instead, she called her a guardian, a woman who had kept her safe while truth did its slow work. The words were clumsy, honest. Marco sat behind their small trio, hands clenched, feeling the rip of power and tender fear running through the room like electricity. Afterwards, when cameras had turned away and the boardrooms recalculated, Isabella found Marco on the roof, under a sky washed clean. The storm had passed. The city smelled of concrete and lemon and something like possibility. "You risked yourself," she said. "You protected a girl," he answered. She reached for the locket she'd kept in a drawer since the night he had brought Elena in. She did not ask for it back. She set it on the ledge and let it catch the late light. "You taught me something dangerous," Isabella said, "that sometimes power is not only in keeping things. It's in letting them go so what remains can breathe." Marco took a breath that belonged to someone who had been given a new name. "And you taught me that power can protect without devouring." Their hands brushed as they reached for the locket at the same time, an accidental, small intimacy that felt like a ceremony. Elena stood a pace behind them, watching both of her protections touch, and for a heartbeat, the three of them were not boss and janitor and orphan. They were a fragile, imperfect family, stitched together by choices that had cost them dearly. Isabella stepped back then, the woman who had spent a life perfecting distance, now making an unpoliced move. She reached out, placed both of her hands on Marco's shoulder, as if anchoring him, and then on Elena, anchoring the child who had taught them to be brave in new and unruly ways. "We will build differently," Isabella said, voice smaller than command. "We will keep what matters." They stood in the rooftop air, each of them raw and steadied, as the city rewired around them. The sacrifice had been made, assets sold, reputations bruised, and in return, a new kind of safety had been carved out. It would not be easy, and it would not be clean. But when Isabella looked at Elena and then at Marco, she felt something like hope settle down over the empire she had once run like a blade. Below them, the city thrummed. Above them, rain bright and honest, fell like a promise. The rooftop wind smelled of wet concrete and something like the future. And for the first time in years, Isabella let herself breathe without measuring the cost. They stood in a loose triangle. Isabella with hands still carrying the weight of boardrooms and quiet ruthlessness. Marco with the soft scar of grief and purpose. Elena, small and fierce and new, the locket catching the last light. The city below hummed with recalculated alliances. Above them, the air felt honest. Elena, Isabella said, the syllable an experiment. It was not an order, it was an offering. You are not obliged to forgive me for everything I have been. Elena looked at Isabella, eyes raw and steady all at once. I don't know if I can forgive you for what I have never been allowed to remember, she said. But I can learn who you are now. The words were both cautious and brave, a truce forged from small truths. Marco watched them exchange the delicate currency of new roles. He had expected gratitude to feel like thunder. Instead, it arrived as a quiet acceptance, the kind that lets you keep breathing. Isabella turned to him then, and for a moment the Donna's armor looked less like iron and more like something she had chosen to wear until she learned otherwise. You stayed when leaving was safer, she said. The admission was simple and dangerous. It made Marco feel like a man who had been given a map to new territory. I stayed because you asked me to, and because I needed to, Marco answered. Not because I am brave, but because I learned that small people can hold large truths. They made plans that evening, practical and humane. Isabella would set up a foundation for vulnerable children, disguised through layers of corporate formality so Enzo's vultures could not rip it apart, and so compassion would not be weaponized. Marco would become the foundation's discreet guardian, his clean hands tending to practical needs, and his older skills used to protect privacy and trace threat. Elena would be given choices, counseling, education, the slow, messy work of being a person rather than a story. They did not promise a perfect life. They promised something harder, to keep showing up. Isabella signed the papers that night with a hand steadier because it belonged to a woman who had risked losing empire for truth. Marco and Elena folded into that decision like thread finding its needle. Before they left the roof, Isabella unclasped the locket and laid it in Elena's palm. "Keep it," she said. "Not as proof, but as a thing that belonged to you before anyone made claims on you." Elena closed her fingers around the metal. It was small and heavy and warm. She turned to Marco and then to Isabella, and the three of them stood for a moment in a line that had no clear hierarchy, only the fragile geometry of chosen family. When they walked down together into the city that had tried to bargain with their grief, they moved differently, not as predator and pawn, not as boss and servant, but as people who had learned the cost of survival and the shape of care. Rain had washed the streets. Lemon polish and concrete smelled like possibility. The Moretti Empire would still demand sacrifices, and markets would still hunger for weakness. But on this night, they had traded bloodless victory for something harder and softer. A future in which a lost daughter could grow, a janitor guardian could be honored, and a Mafia Donna could rebuild power around protection instead of fear. The rooftop light faded. They walked down into the city together, each step a choice toward home.